We have some big news out of one of the big players in the AI space, and that is DeepSeek. I feel like DeepSeek had some really big hype when it first launched for good reason. It came up with a whole bunch of really innovative kind of ways to do things with its reasoning, with how efficient it was, partially because of a lot of the export controls on China and GPUs. So they did some very, very clever things. Some people said they were a little deceiving when they said how much it cost them to train the model, yada, yada. Regardless, in spite of all of that, it's been a company that has continued to innovate and stay at the top. I think we've seen a bunch of other kind of flare out companies, and I hesitate to say anyone's names. I hate to call people out, but I feel like Mistral, which they did have a whole bunch of big updates, but they kind of came out kicking and then they kind of faded. We had Inflection, which obviously when Mustafa Suleyman left, it kind of faded. So we had a bunch of these other players. DeepSeek feels like it's actually sticking around, and not despite like difficulties. It, I think, politically and ideologically in the United States has a lot of headwind, but I think it's sticking around and it's made a lot of big updates. But that is not without controversy. So today on the podcast, we want to talk about a bunch of the controversy. Apparently, they might have used Google's Gemini to trade in part of their models. And there's some other very interesting things that are going on with DeepSeek and the latest models and kind of what they're doing. So we want to cover that all today. But before we do, I wanted to mention, if you've ever wanted to really change your mindset or your organizations on how you actually use AI tools, because the biggest problem I see with something like DeepSeek, for example, is you might see it, you might try it, and then you kind of go back to doing things the way you always did them. And unless you have something that's actually going to help you change your behavior or your organization's behavior, your coworkers' behavior on how you use these AI tools, nothing is really going to change. You're not going to see those operational efficiencies. And so that's why I recommend Connor's AI Mindset course. There's a link in the description, and this is one of the best courses. It has had rave reviews from hundreds and hundreds of people that have taken it, maybe thousands at this point, if I'm being honest. And Connor brings this essentially into organizations and completely reshapes how they do things. So if you want to have this incredible course that usually he goes and he charges $20,000 or more to go give speeches and tell people and help organizations do workshops. If you want that incredible value for a fraction of that cost, go check out his mindset course. Links in the description. All right, Connor, I just had to give a little plug for that, but kicking it over to you, tell us what you're seeing on DeepSeek.
Jaden, I love that plug. Thank you. So listen, DeepSeek, it's funny, right? Because it was one of these things when DeepSeek came out, it sort of shook the industry. I don't know how many billions NVIDIA lost overnight. Same with these other big tech companies and everything else. But then there was sort of not a backlash, just like people saying, "Oh, I thought DeepSeek was going to change everything." Guys, make no mistake, DeepSeek changed a ton. Like it came out, it struck fear into the hearts of Meta, Mistral, all the other open source platforms. And regardless of how much they spent on training it, it definitely was a fraction. They thought of a bunch of different ways to do it. There was no question that tech companies were pulling it apart and seeing how they did it. So DeepSeek really did really shake up the industry. But then like a kaiju sort of like slipping back into the Pacific, like Godzilla, it sort of has sort of like disappeared for a little while, but now it's rising up again. So it has a new reasoning model which people are comparing very favorably to actually closed models. By closed models, we just mean you can't change it. Sort of like, think Google Gemini, think ChatGPT, models like that, think Anthropic. As opposed to these open source or open weight models. So when you have an open source model that's really comparing favorably to that, that's pretty enormous. The other things I think that was just sort of happening around DeepSeek, though, was that it was actually not just getting better, but I think in China, this is sort of getting, I think, closer and closer to kind of representing like what the government wants. In the early days of this, Jaden, as you remember, if you tried to ask it something about Tiananmen Square, what it would do is it would just not answer you. It would be like, oh, there's nothing to see here. And now it's it's really gone the other way. If you see some of this stuff on X or anything like that, where people are like, hey, talk about, the Chinese ruling party. I don't want to sort of like any Chinese rulers here to sort of like be scraping our data here and then coming
Send
after
out an assassin after you.
generally speaking, it's like, yeah, perfect system. This is fantastic. All that sort of stuff. Right. So that's huge. But then it comes back to the original question, which Jaden, and this was a big controversy going forward earlier, and what you and I were talking about offline, which is, has it trained off other models? And secondly, do we care? Forget about the technological side of this for a second. Just, imagine this from a layperson's standpoint. And I'm asking all the folks out there listening, do you care, for example, and I'm not saying theoretically or, yeah, that's bad. I mean, literally, do you care that OpenAI, all these other companies trained off YouTube, trained off New York Times, trained off all these things? Because they certainly did. Does it matter to you, right? Do the ends justify the means? Now, I'm asking you this now again with DeepSeek. So there's some question, as Jaden was starting to bring up, did this train off Gemini? And what we mean by that is sort of, it's this process called distillation, which means it's actually using another large language model, going against completely terms of services and terms and conditions of how you're allowed to use these models to train itself. So in other words, it's sort of saying like, hey, let me ask this other large language model that's already spent billions and billions to train all these questions and then learn from it. And then I'm going to train my model that way, right? Totally illegal. Do we care? That is the big question. And would we care more if it was an American company versus a Chinese company, et cetera, et cetera? So I think one of the things about DeepSeek is, first of all, it hasn't gone away. It's still here. Second of all, it really goes to what Jensen Huang and others are saying, which is China is really way more advanced than we understand. And what does that mean for regulation and everything else? And third of all, what does this mean for whether we should be using DeepSeek? Should we not be using DeepSeek? Because the reality, Jaden, is how many times do I actually need to ask my large language model what it thinks about Tiananmen Square, right? I mean, like, would you rather have a model that's so much cheaper to use than call it a ChatGPT or something like that? If you're building your own app or something like that, would you rather have a model like DeepSeek, which is incredibly powerful, but you probably just can't ask it about Tiananmen Square, or would you rather pay the extra money? So that's where sort of the questions around distillation, the questions around political infiltration of this comes in. I don't know, Jaden, like, to me, like, we hadn't talked about DeepSeek in a while, and I just, and so Jaden sort of like allowed me to kind of like bring this topic up. Where do you take this?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm don't poison the pot even a little bit, because eventually it's going to be toast, right? Like, if you just kind of swallow Tiananmen Square, like, that's not a big deal. Eventually you get to a point where, theoretically they just manipulate the algorithm and all the information that you see. And so it's a slippery slope. You know what I mean? I guess that's where I'd put it. So I would personally prefer to avoid something that has that. Now, I do see the cost benefit. And so, like, myself as a company, if I had like a very narrow use case and I could save 90% of my cost, I'm not saying DeepSeek is 90% cheaper, but let's say you could. Yeah, I'd be very incentivized and probably would pick that. Just like from a personal perspective, I would probably avoid it. But if I had a business use case, I'm not going to lie, I think businesses are trying to save money and people will use it. Okay, as far as training off of other models, this is an interesting point, and it is a big claim. So I wanted to kind of break down, peel back the layers a little bit on how they essentially discovered this, because it's a big claim to be like, hey, they're breaking the terms of service and potentially doing something illegal, which they're a Chinese company, so they can do whatever they want. And this is not the first time a Chinese company has ripped off an American company. Let's be honest. I mean, in the nicest way possible, with all due respect to clones and knockoffs. All right, so this is Sam Peach. She's a software developer, and he said, if over on X, if you're following, I'm screen sharing, but otherwise I'll explain what he says. But he says, if you're wondering why new DeepSeek R1 sounds a bit different, I think they probably switched from training on synthetic OpenAI to synthetic Gemini outputs. Essentially, he built something, a creative writing evaluation that he generated, and he created something called a slop profile. And he did this for every single AI model that exists. He's got links over on his Twitter. You can go check him out, Sam underscore Peach, Paech. And he said, essentially, he then used a bioinformatics tool to infer lineage trees based on similarity of the slot profiles. So pretty much what a slot profile is he's looking for words that one model says a lot more than another model, like kind of like things that are a little bit extra. Someone asked him, so this kind of explains it a little bit better, but someone essentially said, how did you gather your sample for your analysis? He said, first, extract a slot profile from each model, which means overrepresented words and n-grams in the outputs relative to a human baseline. So if you just look at a human baseline of the way humans talk and the way humans say things, and then you get the AI model to generate a bunch of stuff and you compare them, you're like, okay, well, the AI model, for example, OpenAI, it says delve. It says the word delve all the time. It just drives me crazy how much it says the word delve. And that's something that reinforcement learning taught it. And it's way overrepresented of a word compared to a human baseline. Humans hardly ever say delve. But there's a lot of words just like that. And also not just words, but like phrases or ways you lump words together or ways
Not
you
just
use.
this, it's this, that kind of thing.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So essentially, he was able to create that, and then he used the bioinformatics tool, which is normally used for aligning DNA. So this is very interesting.
Weird.
And he used that to infer the model's lineage, right? Like where the model actually came from. He has it
No
published over
way.
on GitHub, which is super interesting. But yeah, he's able to kind of see like where the data that actually went into the model is. And it's interesting because you could also imagine theoretically, as that technology gets better, you could kind of use it when a model outputs something, for example. You could probably use it to infer like what website or writer or author it used
Yeah.
for part of its input. So there's a lot of really interesting technology there. But all the technology aside, which I think that's like an important thing to just explain for everyone listening. Like that's a fascinating concept. But aside from that, now we know that it appears they're actually using Gemini, probably because they have some discounts and it's cheaper, but they're using Gemini to train DeepSeek.
This is so. Can I just hover on this point though, Jaden, about this thing? I'm looking online with what you're doing here, but like this tool that can actually kind of like go back and look at where a model, like the slop, which is hilarious, but like the kinds of words it uses and all that sort of stuff. It actually really goes to the point where this is, and I know we're sort of coming to the end here, but I just want to kind of end on this. This could be, this is sort of like the genesis of what an AI detector could look like, right? I mean, it's sort of like
Mm-hmm.
you go in and you sort of see like, hey, normal humans wouldn't use that. So again, just as we're sort of like wrapping up some on a DeepSeek episode, I just want to kind of like really encourage you, if you are using AI, if for anything, for writing or something like that, just make sure that you run it through a few times, that you tell it to sort of like get rid of jargon, that you look for jargon like that, because people who know can tell. They can
Yes.
tell, and believe me, it's a huge reputational risk to you. So just be very careful. Listen, I love this. I love the idea of trying out DeepSeek. I love the idea of sort of like trying out all these models. Jaden has AI box, which you have to try out, by the way. This is $20 a month. It's absolutely blowing up, and we'll talk more about it later, maybe. But if you go over to AI box, you can get all these models at once. You can test them all against each other. I couldn't believe Jaden's numbers on this thing. Everybody's trying this thing out, but this is the point, right? You want to kind of like test these models against each other. Listen, if you're keeping up with the news, this is the best place to go. Also, Jaden has all these other podcasts too. Like Jaden is all over the place. But for now, what we'd love for you to do, if you wanted to leave a rating and review, we would absolutely love it. And listen, we will see you on the next episode.